Hi, I'm Pilar Bewley from Mainly Montessori, and today I want to chat a little bit about a question that I get asked a lot, which is how do you prepare in order to give a lesson? What's the best way to prepare? Should we memorize every single presentation just the way that it says it in the album? Can we bring our albums to a lesson and just kind of follow along? Should we have notes? And if so, what kind of notes? What works? Well, I want to start with a little story that my elementary trainer told me when I was back in Italy. And she said that when Maria and Mario Montessori were starting the elementary training programs for adults, back over 50 years ago, they had huge groups. They had over 200 students in any particular training year. And so they gave the lectures, all the theory lectures, to the entire group. But then when it came time to learn about the materials and to practice the lessons, they would break this giant group down into smaller groups. And they had assistant trainers. And so the job of these assistant trainers was to take 10 or 20 students and give them a presentation on a particular topic. And so they would have 10, 15 tables with 10, 15 assistant trainers, each one giving the same presentation, focusing on the same presentation. But what was interesting was that every single trainer did things differently. And so the presentation was the same, for example, dynamic subtraction with the stamp game, but the way that they did it was totally different. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that we don't have to memorize, right? We don't use albums and lessons as scripts. Absolutely not at all. And there are many reasons for that. It's overwhelming for the adult. It creates a lot of anxiety. You're going to mess up, right? And it also prevents you from being genuine and from connecting with your child. And so what do we do instead? Should we drag our album to the lesson and put it next to us and follow along? Well, that's also not really recommended. And the reason for this is because it's going to put you in a position where you're going to be focusing more on following a script than on engaging with your child. So what do we do if we're not supposed to memorize? We're not supposed to read from the album. How do we take effective notes? And it is totally valid to bring notes to a lesson. But how do we do it in a way that's effective? So I want to share with you 3 questions that you can ask yourself when you're preparing your notes and you're preparing in order to later give a presentation. So the first question is, what's the concept that I want to isolate? Now, if you know a little bit about Montessori, you've been working with the materials for a bit, you will notice that each lesson isolates one single concept, right? We don't want to give the child too much. What we want to do is gradually build one little lesson on top of the other. So again, the question is, what is the concept that I want to isolate? Once you've determined that from reading through the presentation in your album, the second question is, how does the material illustrate this concept? So the Montessori materials are what Dr. Montessori used to call materialized abstractions. And so what that means is it's a concrete or sensory way to illustrate a concept that is usually just understood in a person's mind. And so what the materials allow us to do is for the children to use their senses to understand these very abstract concepts. And that's why children who use Montessori materials can understand concepts or work with concepts at an earlier age, because they are using their senses to get in touch with this concept. So our question, what we need to be thinking about as we're preparing and as we're practicing with the material, is how does the material illustrate this concept that I want to isolate? And then the third question is, what points of consciousness do I need to guide my child's attention towards? So by points of consciousness, I mean, what do I need to make my child aware of as we're doing the presentation and as they're doing the work? What are the most important aspects that will allow them to really grasp this concept that I'm trying to isolate? Let's take as an example dynamic subtraction with the stamp game. if we think about the first question, what is the concept that I want to isolate? Well, in this case, we're isolating the idea of borrowing, right? We're isolating the play between the hierarchies. So that's all we want to isolate. We're assuming, obviously, that the child is already familiar with static subtraction, which is just the taking away. So we're just going to isolate that one concept. So you write that down in your notes because you want that to be front of mind. It'll help you to stay focused on what you're presenting and not go off on a tangent. So then the second question, how does the material illustrate this concept? Well, what's brilliant about the subtraction material is that you cannot take away, physically cannot take away from a quantity that is not available. So if your problem says that you have 4 units and then it asks you to take away 7 units, the child is seeing there that it is impossible to do that. So now you really understand how the material is going to transmit that concept to your child. Third question, what point of consciousness or points of consciousness do I need to direct my child's attention towards? Well, if you're thinking about the dynamic subtraction work with the stamp game, you might want to think about, what do I need to do to have enough stamps? And so asking your child that question during the presentation process will direct your child's attention towards the fact that, oh, I have to borrow, I have to get stamps from somewhere else in order to have enough, right? So that's highlighting the concept of borrowing. Another question is, where do I need to borrow from? Now that we've established that we need to borrow, where do I need to borrow from? And then you can kind of come up with little routines, especially if you notice that the child is making the same mistakes over and over again. So for example, I had a wonderful co-teacher who noticed that a child was getting really confused with borrowing. They would borrow without doing the actual exchanging, and all the answers were wrong. And so she came up with a little song for the child, which was simply, put it in, take it out, put it in, take it out. And so that really helped the child to remember that first you need to put in the 10 stamp before you take out the units stamps, right? So it can be something as simple as that. And you can really adapt it based on what you're seeing your child doing during the presentation and during the practice. But what is really important is that you're paying attention, right? And this is why taking notes is important, because if you're busy following a script, you're not going to be noticing what your child is doing.